The day we buried Margaret, it rained. Not the soft, quiet kind of rain that feels like the sky is mourning with you. It was a hard, sideways Alberta rain, the kind that soaks through your coat before you even realize it started. I stood at the grave in my good black suit, the one she'd picked out for me years ago at the bay in Edmonton, and I watched them lower her into the ground. 41 years. 41 years of her laugh, her cooking, her hand reaching for mine in the dark. And now this. My son Derek stood to my left. My daughter-in-law Cheryl stood slightly behind him, which I noticed even then slightly behind, not beside, like she was already calculating the distance between grief and opportunity. My younger son Paul flew in from Winnipeg. He stood on my right and didn't say a word the entire service. Just put his hand on my shoulder once, briefly, and that was enough. That was Paul. I am 67 years old. I spent 32 years working for the city of Calgary as a civil engineer. I own a house in the southwest, a 4-bedroom detached on a quiet crescent that Margaret and I bought in 1991 for $187,000. Today, it's worth somewhere around $820,000, maybe more in this market. Margaret handled our finances with a discipline I always admired but never fully understood. She kept spreadsheets on everything. She read the fine print on every document. She planned. I didn't know how much she had planned until 3 weeks after we put her in the ground. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The week after the funeral, Derek and Cheryl came by every day. I told myself it was because they cared. Derek is 42, works in commercial real estate in Calgary, and has a gift for talking about money in ways that make you feel like he's doing you a favor. Cheryl works in mortgage lending. Together they are, as Margaret once quietly described them, very motivated people. The first few visits were fine. They brought food. They helped me sort through some of Margaret's things, though I asked them not to rush. On the 4th day, Derek sat down across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and what I can only describe as his professional face. "Dad," he said, "I've been thinking about your situation." I told him I wasn't aware I had a situation. He smiled the way he smiles at clients. "The house," he said, "it's a lot to maintain on your own. 4 bedrooms, the yard, the driveway, in winter. You're 67. Have you thought about what comes next?" I told him Margaret had been gone 11 days. "I know, Dad, I know." He reached across and patted my hand. "But these things take time to arrange, and the market right now you could walk away with serious money. Enough to be completely comfortable for the rest of your life. We could help you find something smaller. A condo, maybe. Something manageable." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I told him I'd think about it. Cheryl was in the living room, I realized. I could hear her moving around in there. I hadn't invited her past the kitchen. That night I sat alone in the house, and I let myself feel the full weight of it. The silence that had replaced Margaret. Her reading glasses still on the side table. Her tea mug still in the drying rack because I couldn't bring myself to put it away. And underneath the grief, like a stone at the bottom of a cold river, something else, a feeling I hadn't named yet. The calls started the following week. Derek would phone in the mornings, casually, and somehow the conversation always turned to the house. The equity, the opportunity. He forwarded me listings for condos in Mahogany and Cranston, nice enough places, I'll admit, with little notes attached. "Dad, look at Unit 412. Ground floor, no stairs. Walk to the amenities." Cheryl called once to mention she knew a great real estate lawyer. I thanked her and hung up. Paul called from Winnipeg to check on me. Not about the house, just about me. He asked if I was sleeping. He asked if I was eating. He asked if I wanted him to drive out for a weekend. I told him I was fine, and I think he believed me just enough not to push. Paul is like that. He respects what you say, even when you're lying a little. 3 weeks to the day after the funeral, I received a call from a woman named Sandra Bellamy. She was a solicitor in Red Deer, and she introduced herself as the executor of a private estate matter connected to my wife. I sat down. Sandra explained, carefully and professionally, that Margaret had retained her services 14 months earlier, that Margaret had purchased in her own name, through a numbered Alberta corporation, a property outside of Rocky Mountain House, 42 acres, a cabin, a barn, and a small workshop, fully paid. no mortgage. She had arranged everything through her own savings, accumulated over years from careful investing, a small inheritance from her mother that I knew about but had never fully tracked, and a disciplined personal account she had maintained since before we were married. I asked Sandra to repeat the figure. The property had been purchased for $310,000. The account attached to the corporation held an additional $94,000 in liquid assets. Margaret had left everything, the land, the corporation, the account, to me, along with a letter. I drove to Red Deer the next morning. Sandra's office was small and neat, with one of those electric fireplaces that actually does a decent job. She gave me coffee and Margaret's letter in a sealed envelope and left me alone in the room. I won't share everything Margaret wrote. Some of it is mine. But she told me she had started setting this aside after Derek and Cheryl's wedding, when she first noticed something in her daughter-in-law that made her uneasy. She wrote, "I hope I'm wrong, Robert. I've been wrong before, but if I'm not, I want you to have somewhere to go that is entirely yours. Somewhere they can't calculate the square footage of." She told me about the cabin. She said she'd driven out to see it twice without telling me, because she wanted to be sure before she got my hopes up. She said the nearest town was a 20-minute drive, and the nearest gas station was 11 minutes, and the view from the back porch faced the Clearwater River Valley, and she thought I would love it. She signed it the way she always signed cards to me. Just her name, and 2 words after it, "Your Margaret." I sat in that office for a long time. Then I drove back to Calgary, and I did not tell Derek. I want to be honest about why I kept quiet. Part of it was grief. I was still raw and not ready to defend myself against whatever reaction was coming. But most of it was something clearer than that. Margaret had built this quietly and deliberately, and for a specific reason. She had seen what I had not let myself see, and she had built me a door. I was not going to open it before I was ready to walk through it. I started making trips out to Rocky Mountain House on weekends, telling no one. The property was accessed by a gravel road about 6 kilometers off Highway 11, through a stand of spruce that opened suddenly into a clearing. The cabin was solidly built log construction, 2 bedrooms, a wood stove, and a covered porch that faced west. The barn was in reasonable shape and smelled like the good kind of old wood. The 42 acres included pasture, a creek, and a back corner of pure rock and pine that made you feel small in the right way. I am not a farmer. I want to be clear about that. But I had spent my career designing infrastructure for other people's lives, and I knew how to assess a property, and what I saw in those 42 acres was something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Possibility. I hired a contractor from Rocky Mountain House named Glenn, who was quiet and competent and charged fair rates. We spent 6 weeks going through the cabin, room by room, new wiring in the kitchen. The plumbing in the second bathroom needed work. The porch boards on the north side were soft and had to come up. Glenn and his nephew did most of the heavy lifting while I handled what I could and tried to stay out of their way. I paid from the corporate account Margaret had left me. Meanwhile, back in Calgary, things were accelerating. Derek had started bringing Cheryl to the house openly now, not just waiting in the living room. She would walk through rooms, and I noticed her doing the things she probably did professionally, assessing, estimating, her eyes moving from the windows to the ceilings in that particular way. Derek spoke about a realtor friend who could list the house quickly. He mentioned a condo he and Cheryl had just happened to see that was perfect for me. He mentioned, carefully, that at my age, managing a property this size alone was maybe not ideal. I listened. I nodded. I made no commitments. One Wednesday in October, I came home earlier than expected from a meeting at the city pension office. I had given Derek a key the previous year, during a stretch when my back was bad and he was helping me with groceries. I had not asked for it back. I unlocked the front door and found Cheryl in my home office. She was at Margaret's desk, which I had not touched, and she had what appeared to be a file folder open on the surface. She looked up when I came in, and for just a moment there was nothing on her face. No surprise, no embarrassment, just a half-second of calculation. Then she smiled. "Oh, Robert, you're back early. I was just waiting for Derek. He's coming by later, and I thought I'd wait inside. It was cold." I looked at the desk. I looked at her. I said very calmly that I would need the key back. Today, before she left. She gave it to me. She was pleasant about it. She said, "Of course." She completely understood, and she was sorry if she'd made me uncomfortable. Derek arrived 20 minutes later, and I could hear the two of them in the hallway. Voices low. Derek came in and apologized. He said she meant no harm. He said she was just curious. He said he'd talk to her. I told him it was fine. It wasn't fine. But I had one more thing to do before I was ready to act. Paul drove out from Winnipeg in November. He stayed 4 days, and we didn't talk about the house once. We watched hockey. We drove out to Bragg Creek for lunch. On his last night, we sat at the kitchen table with 2 bottles of Molson Canadian, and I told him everything. The letter from Sandra Bellamy, the cabin, the corporate account, the trips to Rocky Mountain House. All of it. Paul listened without interrupting, which is one of his best qualities. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did she know about Derek and Cheryl?" I told him what Margaret had written, that she'd hoped she was wrong. Paul looked at the table for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" I told him nothing for now. I told him just to be patient. I told him I might ask him to drive out to Rocky Mountain House in the spring, if he was willing, to see what I'd built. He said he'd be there. In December, I called a real estate agent, not Derek's contact, but a woman named Patricia who I'd found independently and who came with strong reviews and no connection to anyone in my family. Patricia walked through the house in January, gave me a straightforward assessment, and we listed it in February. The market in Calgary's southwest moved fast that winter. We had 4 offers inside of 10 days. I accepted one at $847,000, possession in 60 days. I told Patricia to handle all communications and to keep my name off any public-facing documents until the sale was firm. She was professional and did exactly that. I arranged a moving company for a Thursday in late March. I had been quietly sorting Margaret's things for months by then, what to keep, what to donate, what to give to Paul. I kept her reading glasses. I kept the tea mug. I packed everything I needed into the truck over 2 days, mostly by myself. I did not call Derek. On the Friday before the possession date, my phone rang. It was Derek. He said he'd driven by the house and seen the sold sign on the lawn. His voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, something between confusion and something harder. He said, "Dad, what did you do?" I told him I sold the house. He said, "Where are you going to live?" "Dad, you should have talked to me. We had a plan. Cheryl and I had been looking at." I told him that I was aware he and Cheryl had a plan. I told him that I had a different one. He asked me where I was going. I told him I had a property outside of Rocky Mountain House, that it was mine, that Margaret had left it to me. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then he said, "How much is it worth?" I told him it wasn't for sale. He said he didn't understand why I would move to the middle of nowhere at my age. He said this wasn't practical. He said we needed to sit down and talk about this as a family, that there were financial considerations, that at some point I was going to need support, and who exactly was going to provide that if I was 4 hours from Calgary. I let him finish. Then I told him that I was 67 years old, that I had worked for 32 years, that I had paid for that house in Calgary and built equity in it over 30 years, and I had every legal and moral right to sell it and do whatever I chose with the proceeds, that I had a property I loved in a place I intended to be happy, that Paul knew where I was and how to reach me, that if Derek wanted a relationship with his father, I was not difficult to find, but I would not be found at a condo he had selected for me. He tried once more. He said, "Dad, I just want what's best for you." I told him I knew he believed that, and I hung up. I was on the property by the first week of April. The snow was still heavy in the back corner by the rock and pine, but the clearing around the cabin had started to melt and the creek was running loud and cold under the bridge. Glenn had helped me repair. Paul drove out on the 3rd weekend and stood on the back porch looking at the valley and didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "She picked a good one." I told him she always did. There's a thing that happens in the morning out here, around 6:30, when the light comes in flat and gold across the pasture and the spruce trees hold it for just a moment before the wind moves through. Margaret never saw it. I see it for both of us. I set up the workshop in the barn that first summer. I'm not building anything in particular, just working with my hands, which I hadn't done properly in 20 years, and finding that there's a version of yourself that only comes back when you give it the right kind of quiet. Twice since April, Derek has called. The first time he asked about the proceeds from the house sale, whether I had planned anything for them. I told him I had. The second time he apologized. I don't know yet what to do with that. Margaret would probably say, give him time. Margaret was usually right. Paul came back in June with his daughter, my granddaughter Emma, who is 9, and loudly opinionated, and wanted to know if there were horses. There aren't yet. I told her maybe by fall, which was either a promise or a plan. I'm still working that out. What I know is this. Margaret saw what was coming, and she built me somewhere to land. Not because she was angry at Derek, I don't think, but because she knew me well enough to know I wouldn't fight for myself, that I would give ground to keep the peace, that I needed a door already open, or I'd never leave. She gave me the door. I walked through it, and on the back porch on a Tuesday morning, with the Clearwater Valley going gold in the early light, and the coffee hot in the mug she would have chosen, I am for the first time in longer than I can honestly say exactly where I'm supposed to be.